Hello my fellow strawmen and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. In most of the video responses I make to theists, it feels like they're willfully ignorant, either misrepresenting science or the atheist rebuttals to their arguments. So when I see a video from a theist who is honest about their beliefs, and careful to steelman their opponents, it'd be wrong of me to pass it up. Dan Paterson, at least from the one video I've seen and am about to respond to, seems to be one of those theists. In fact, in naming this video, I realized that he wasn't misunderstanding enough for me to put him in my Apologists Understand Nothing playlist, nor was I answering his questions, and those are the only two playlists I've made for response videos to theists. So I had to make a new category. Moving forward, I hope to find more theists like Dan, because if my channel only addresses those who are the worst representatives of religion, then I'm guilty of a fallacy known as nutpicking. So here's to filling up this playlist with a more nuanced discussion of God, and I can think of nobody better to start us off than Dan.
Of the 24 or so arguments for God that Christian philosophers marshal in the cumulative case for God, one stands above all others in how often atheists admit that it keeps them up at night. Yes, fine-tuning. So if you're curious about what all the fuss is about, let me take you on a whirlwind tour, exploring what physicists have discovered, unveiling my favorite way to turn the fine-tuning into an argument for God, and offering some brief responses to 5 common objections atheists raise.
Yeah, I agree that teleological arguments tend to be among Christianity's best. Personally, it was the watchmaker argument that most convinced me of God's existence as a child, but that argument falls apart due to scientific discoveries. On the other hand, the fine-tuning argument appears to be caused by scientific discoveries. This is the one that Dan will be focusing on today, and if you want my full opinion on it, I'll link here to my video I made on it. In short, for most of the constants presented, it isn't a probability, but a percent change which is calculated, and those simply aren't the same thing. There's plenty of other nuance I'll get into as needed, but for now, let's see if any of the 5 objections Dan brings up are related to any of mine, and if not, whether they're still good objections.
So what is fine-tuning? Well, cosmic fine-tuning is a scientific discovery that at the deepest level, our universe is surprisingly calibrated to allow for life. The initial distribution of mass energy, the strength of gravity, the cosmological constant, even the strong nuclear force. In literature on this subject, penned by scientists of religious and irreligious stripes, physicists have identified how dozens of these fundamental building blocks of our universe, these initial conditions and laws and constants, fall to within an extremely narrow life-permitting range, as though someone has finely tuned all the dials so our universe could support life. Run computer simulations where you turn these dials in either direction, changing the numbers even just by a hair's breadth, and you get a completely sterile universe. No galaxies, no stars, no chemistry, no life. Fine-tuning arguments then, they take this scientific observation of fine-tuning and they seek to make the case that somehow this is good evidence for God.
Yeah, a fair summary of the fine-tuning argument. The way I understand it, the problem presented is that we only know of one universe, and it has constants which allow for life. But if these constants were any different, life wouldn't exist. To take an example, the most common constant I hear quoted is the strength of the gravitational constant. If gravity were stronger, then all mass would have collapsed into a black hole before any galaxies or stars formed and life had any chance to develop. If it were weaker, then the expansion of the universe would have dominated, and all matter would have been spread so thin that nothing could ever happen. If the value of big G were different by 1 part in 10 to the 60, then the universe would have tipped one way or another and life couldn't have formed. There are several ways to explain this, like referencing a multiverse or saying that life could potentially exist in completely different forms than what we know. But these ideas are unfalsifiable, and while they're valid possibilities, I'd rather not rely on them if I can help it. So let's hear a little more detail from Dan and see if I can give a rebuttal that doesn't lean too heavily on these concepts.
So what exactly is the fine-tuning argument? Well, perhaps the most famous version defended today comes from William Lane Craig and seeks to establish design deductively. The syllogism goes like this. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore conclusion, it is due to design.
It is premise 2 that I have the biggest issue with. I don't know that we can rule out physical necessity. Physics may not currently have an answer, but we know that general relativity and quantum mechanics are incomplete. And as we learn more, we may come to know that some of these constants are linked together. Perhaps any increase to gravity's strength must be paired with an increase in the strength of dark energy, and the expansion of the universe must necessarily be balanced. So perhaps it is due to physical necessity, even if the current theories don't say so. And as to chance, if we are to rule it out, we need to calculate the probability of these constants allowing for life, and see that it is absurdly small. The big problem is that most of the numbers presented, like big G's restriction to being within 1 part in 10 to the 60, simply aren't calculations of probability. They're calculations of percent change. It simply isn't the right calculation. So while I cannot definitively say that it was chance or physical necessity, let's not forget that at this point, Dan carries the burden of proof, and I don't think he is truly able to rule out either possibility.
Now, in this version, premise 2 tends to be the controversial premise, but the current state of physics does not predict or require our finely tuned numbers. We can imagine them being different and run computer simulations as such. So physical necessity doesn't seem like a live option.
The key thing here being the current state of physics. While it doesn't look promising for physical necessity, the fact remains that the current state of physics is incomplete. We don't know how physics should be applied to cases where relativity and quantum mechanics conflict, which is exactly the case for the beginning of the known universe. This is the cosmic fine-tuning argument, and it is exactly at this cosmic scale that our physics are known to break down. So while I can't provide an absolutely certain explanation for how the constants are physically necessary, neither can we say that they definitively aren't. So far, premise 2 has not carried its burden of proof.
And when you consider the improbability of any one of these dials being so finely tuned, let alone dozens of them as though in a combination lock, chance just is not a reasonable explanation.
If you really wanted to know what the probability is that the cosmic constants allow for life, there are two probability distributions you must know. First, you'd have to know what the likelihood of life is for any given value the constants could take. And second, you'd have to know the distribution of each constant taking on any particular value. For the first one, we don't know if there are other kinds of life that can exist under a completely different set of physics, and without this knowledge, we simply can't make a proper calculation, at least as far as I'm aware. But for the sake of this conversation, let me grant that carbon-based life may be the only kind of life that can exist. Let's say that for most of the possible values of the various cosmological constants, life of this kind does not arise. So it comes down to the second distribution, and it is here we find our critical problem. While it's intuitive to assume a uniform probability distribution, the constants would then be able to take on any of infinite values. Under a uniform distribution, then it doesn't matter how forgivingly the dials can be set, life would be statistically impossible. I suppose that's a point for the fine-tuning argument, except that it seems dishonest to the intent. It would seem to imply that no matter what constants are life supporting, so long as the most extreme values are hostile to life, then life would be impossible. So a uniform distribution seems unlikely, and what the actual distribution is, we have no way to know. Once you have those two and can get the probability, there is a third thing which must be considered if chance is to be ruled out. The expected number of life-bearing universes would be the probability that a universe can bear life times the number of universes which exist. If you get more than one living universe, or even a number closer to 1 than to 0, then observer bias can explain the rest and fine-tuning is solved. Yes, it's the multiverse defense. But while it is a plausible possibility, and it is on Dan to bear the burden of proof to rule it out, I don't like necessitating unfalsifiable beliefs into my worldview. So just as I'm willing to grant that carbon-based life may be the only form of existing life, I'm willing to grant that our universe may very well be the only one in existence. If there is only one universe, then the problem reduces back down to the second point about the probability of the constants taking on some value. But if I can grant both of these concessions, I would ask the theist to concede one back to me. It is possible that the dials can be changed, but we do not know for sure. And it is also possible that the dials can't be changed, that they must be what they are now. And so the probability of a life-bearing universe could well be 100%. I would like the theist to grant me this possibility and recognize the flaw it presents for the second point. And if not, then I will take back my concessions about the potential multitude of other life forms and other universes, and let them deal with the challenge to the first and third points. This leaves no way for the theist to consistently claim that chance can be ruled out.
And the staunchly skeptical physicist Fred Hoyle says that the fine-tuning of the universe is as likely as a group of monkeys composing Shakespeare's Hamlet by randomly banging away on typewriters. Hoyle concludes, a common-sense interpretation of these facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with the physics.
There is a single constant pointed at in the fine-tuning argument which doesn't have the flaw of being a percent change disguised as an improbability. If I'm being charitable, this is probably the one that Hoyle is talking about, and it's an apt analogy to say that such a primate-produced poem is far more likely than random chance accounting for this particular constant. In fact, I think it'd be more probable to see monkeys put on a live performance of Hamlet by random babbling and stumbling around. It's the big one, the 10 to the 10 to the 120 chance of the entropy being as low as it was at the Big Bang, rather than one of the much more likely states associated with heat death. I concede that random chance cannot account for this one, and only physical necessity remains as a possibility. However, the state which would be the single most improbable state going by random chance would also be the only one accountable by simple mathematical symmetry, the zero entropy state. It is, by definition, the only state that would not need some further reason for the universe to exist in such a state. Perhaps the low entropy of the universe prior to the Big Bang was no fluke, but a simple necessity of being uncaused.
So it seems Craig's version of the argument, it certainly is defensible. Personally, though, following conversations with physicist friends like Luke Barnes, my favorite versions of the fine-tuning argument tend to be a little bit more humble in their conclusions, framed abductively rather than deductively, coming up with theism as the inference to the best explanation. Something like premise 1, the universe appears fine-tuned for life. Premise 2, the best explanation of fine-tuning is theism. Therefore, conclusion, fine-tuning provides some evidential support for theism.
I think one of the reasons why I find Dan's rhetoric so honest is that he isn't forcing himself to take the strongest stance he can. He could try to defend Craig's argument and say that the universe is designed, but he prefers to use the argument that concludes the universe is likely designed. It's not as certain a claim, and that makes it harder for me to argue that it's wrong. Well played. I think my rebuttal has to point out that premise 2 ought to say the best explanation of the appearance of fine-tuning is theism, since it is only the appearance of fine-tuning that the first premise claims to exist. This subtle change opens up some options for me, because it isn't fine-tuning that I need to explain, but just the appearance of such. It'd be like the difference between trying to explain a magician who read my mind versus explaining one who simply appeared to do so. If someone actually read my mind, I'd be amazed. But if someone just appears to, then I know of plenty of mentalists who will attest to completely natural techniques that can produce such effects. Similarly, if the universe really is fine-tuned, then that's incredible, and perhaps a god is the best explanation. But if it only appears fine-tuned, then perhaps there is just some other reason we don't know about. It goes back to the problem I have with ruling out physical necessity as a possibility. We simply don't know enough about how the dials can be moved to know that their current setting is improbable. These dials are not in the light of day clear to see. It isn't as though the constants that the fine-tuning argument points to are things which we interact with and can feel confident in our understanding of them. No, in the sense of how far we see from the backs of the giants we stand on. They are in the extreme distance, at the very edges of our perception. They rely on our extrapolations of relativity into a cosmological application we can't trust in. For all we know, the dials are mere shadows of our imagination. With this alone, I could say that we do not know if physical necessity can account for what we see, and the same goes for God. But there is one problem I see with God as an explanation, which boils down to a simple question. Is God a minimally fine-tuned being? If the answer is yes, then how is that compatible with the divine properties of omniscience or maximal greatness? But if the answer is no, then presenting God as a solution to the fine-tuning problem is really just presenting a bigger problem. I don't know whether physical necessity or chance could account for our existence, but they seem plausible. I don't think I can say the same of a God. So with Dan's explanation and my basic rebuttal out of the way, let's get into the 5 objections that Dan has heard the most and how he contends them.
So let's look at 5 common skeptical objections to the fine-tuning argument. Objection number 1, God of the gaps reasoning.
I wouldn't agree with this objection, although it can depend on the presentation. Craig's version explicitly acknowledged 2 other possibilities. I think he's wrong to rule those possibilities out, but he's making much more subtle errors than just shoving God into whatever holes he has in his knowledge. It's a mistake to appeal to modern physics to rule out physical necessity when modern physics is incomplete. And it's a mistake to rule out chance when we don't have access to the probabilities of the universe being what it is. But conflating percent probability with percent change, or giving science more authority than it deserves, are not as blatant a mistake as arguing for a God of the gaps. In Dan's version of the argument, he doesn't say that God is the answer, it's just the most likely one he can think of. It isn't that he's never thought about alternates or is just uncomfortable with his ignorance, filling the ignorant gap with God. Instead, I think he's put a lot of time and effort into thinking about this topic, and God is the most convincing answer he has yet found. The trichotomy of necessity, chance, or design feels appropriate to me, given that intent is synonymous with design, and unintentional things can either happen out of necessity or by chance. I think Dan has bad reasons for thinking chance and necessity to be such poor options, and I think there are good reasons to believe that design is a bad option, but I don't think it is a God of the gaps argument to reason as Dan has. He doesn't claim to be certain, only that the information he knows seems to point in a particular direction, and I struggle to think of anything wrong with that.
Richard Dawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson, for instance, argue that the apparent design in nature that led to Gregory's lyre or Paley's watch, like the intricacy of the human eye, that has since been explained away by naturalistic mechanisms, such as those that drive Darwinian evolution.
I think that the complexity of life pointed at in the watchmaker argument is the single best indicator theists have ever found for design. The fact that the living organism is in such a complex state implies that it could be much simpler, and presumably non-living. Imagine putting an organism through a blender, and you'll have an idea of the simpler, non-living arrangement of its matter to which I refer. The fact that the life form is in such an improbable state begs an explanation, and if it weren't for the nature of self-replicating systems to undergo natural selection, a mechanism to explain such complexity, I'd find this argument incredibly convincing. And as Paley's argument can be explained by evolution in general, so too can the lyre argument be explained by human evolution in the context of a social population. The cosmological fine-tuning argument doesn't have the process of evolution to explain it, but neither does it point to the complexity of the watchmaker argument. It points to a bunch of dials. We know the matter of living organisms can be rearranged and their particular arrangement is unlikely. But we don't know that the dials can be turned, and we don't understand the consequences of if they were. Without knowing this, the cosmic argument carries no weight. It would only be if we had a teleological argument that took the unity of the cosmic fine-tuning argument and combined it with the improbable complexity of the watchmaker argument. I'd find it very convincing indeed.
So we don't need God anymore. We just need more science. And in the end, any appearance of design will ultimately disappear, including from fine-tuning. But this objection runs the risk of affirming a naturalism of the gaps, where in the face of a good argument for design, against all the present odds of available evidence, atheists confidently affirm science will one day vindicate a naturalistic explanation of reality.
Part of the reason I'm careful not to call his argument God of the gaps is because this is a salient point. I think that physical necessity may very well be the explanation for fine-tuning, but that is in part because I don't know what the true physics of our universe is. But like Dan, I qualify my knowledge. I don't claim that science certainly will discover these physics in the future, only that I think it's the most likely explanation. I think it's most likely that the appearance of fine-tuning is due to our own misunderstanding, which stems from having incomplete knowledge of cosmology. I'll agree with Dan about the three options on the table, and if I just ruled out design because I don't know how a designer could be an explanation, then that would be naturalism of the gaps. But I don't do that. I use my argument device to rule out God. I reject solipsism and claim that God is a solipsist. That leaves the other two options on the table, which is why I believe one of them probably necessity to be the case.
The fascinating thing about fine-tuning is that the deeper we have dug scientifically into the origins of our universe, that is where the evidence of design screams loudest. I love the quote by Werner Heisenberg, the Nobel Prize winner and father of quantum mechanics, who said, "The first gulp from the glass of the natural sciences will turn you into an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you." And cosmic fine-tuning is not a surface-level observation. It's at the very bottom of the glass of our universe. And no appeal to cosmic, chemical, or even biological evolution has any bearing on the fine-tuning of these numbers. And so there is no appeal to scientific ignorance. It is because of our deep scientific knowledge of fine-tuning, along with an absence of reasonable naturalistic alternatives, that renders the inference to theism a rational step.
Perhaps the last drink from the cup makes God look likely, but there is still a whole pitcher worth of refills. It may be the case that our modern cosmology can't account for the physical necessity of the dials being what they are, but we still don't understand dark energy, dark matter, or how to unify relativity with quantum mechanics. It is too early to say that the necessity is not contained in one of these unknown answers. There is here a hint of God of the gaps, but I see it more as overly extrapolating what we do know. And while I will agree that chemical and biological evolution could not have played a role in setting the dials of cosmology, there are ideas that get floated around, like black holes forming universes inside them. And so universes which produce black holes will produce more universes, and you can have the self-replication of universes from which selected evolution stems. But I'm sure you can guess what I think about this idea. If you'd like a hint, it's the same category as multiverses, simulation theory, or last Thursdayism. I don't think any of them are necessarily true, but they are all equally or more plausible than God.
Objection number 2, the hostile universe objection. Another common objection is that the universe is almost entirely inhospitable to life. The vacuum of space, extreme temperatures, dead planets, black holes. Fermi's paradox shows just how poorly this universe is fine-tuned for life because we can't see it anywhere else. So if fine-tuning for life was God's goal, then this hostile universe is not exactly what we would expect to find.
I don't think this is a good objection either. The fine-tuning argument isn't about finding a universe so well tuned to be teeming with life, just tuned enough that life can exist at all. However, I would say that the mostly dead universe is what we would expect to see if natural mechanisms alone could account for life. Granting that life requires liquid water, it would be unlikely for some random planet to support life. However, if there are trillions upon trillions of planets, then surely some would support liquid water, and almost certainly at least some of these would meet any other criteria life requires. The many dead planets we see in the universe give us the numbers we need to overwhelm the improbabilities of Earth being friendly to life. But to say that the universe is not fine-tuned enough to be within our expectations of design assumes too much about knowing the mind of God. Perhaps to him, a single planet filled with life is enough.
But this objection simply dodges the point, comparing the hostile conditions of the universe negatively against the hospitable conditions of life here on Earth. But fine-tuning, however, does not predict that the universe should be crammed with living beings from end to end and from start to finish, nor does Christian theism. No, the fine-tuning argument simply tries to offer an explanation as to why, despite the odds, life is possible anywhere in our universe.
Yeah, exactly. I understand the fine-tuning argument to point to, for example, different values of gravity, and claim that such a value would completely preclude life from happening at all.
Objection 3. Superfluous fine-tuning. Some critics have questioned why God would even need to fine-tune the universe for life, given he could easily create and sustain life here on Earth in a sort of supernatural bubble, miraculously protecting us from the hostile or chaotic parameters beyond.
I don't think that God couldn't have made the universe any other way, but if some particular religion wants to explain why their particular God made the particular decisions it did to make our particular reality, I'm fine with that. In Christian theology, I'm aware of explanations of God wanting to set the universe in motion and then be mostly hands-off to let humans learn their lessons as a society and develop their own technology. To say that the universe we see goes against the expectations of a God creating a universe relies too much on assuming the intentions of that God. God could is not the same as God would. We can't say that just because God could have made the universe differently, that he would have. And therefore we cannot say that this version of a universe is somehow incompatible with God.
Since God's goal in the Christian story is human development as stewards of creation, for us to grow in spiritual, intellectual, and moral maturity, I think a finely tuned universe is predicted on Christian theism, nullifying this objection.
Given what I said earlier, I broadly agree with this point, but I'd be curious to know how strongly Dan would stand by this prediction. If we lived in a universe in which nature clearly did follow the whims of some god, would that nullify Christianity to him?
But again, don't miss how critics here dodge the central challenge of fine-tuning. They offer no naturalistic alternative to the design hypothesis.
I agree with him on this one. The critics who use this objection are missing the point. It's tenuous to say that the expected actions of God are incompatible with the fine-tuning we think we see. And while I can only give possibilities like undiscovered physics, let's not forget that it is on the argument to bear the burden of proof. I don't have to demonstrate that these possibilities really could exist. The other side needs to demonstrate why they can't. If we get stuck in the middle and don't know whether they're possible, then the argument just hits a dead end.
Objection number 4, the multiverse objection. This is the big one, and the only really serious game in town for refuting the fine-tuning argument. Here critics say Christians they're too hasty in dismissing chance as a reasonable explanation. As fine-tuning, it's only extremely improbable if you only have a single universe. But what if there is an infinite number of universes, each with those fundamental dials randomized? Surely with so many rolls at the cosmic dice, then eventually you will get a life-permitting universe. So couple the existence of the multiverse together with the anthropic principle, and of course we observe a finely tuned universe, as only a finely tuned universe would produce observers like us in the first place. So if a multiverse is possible, some would even say plausible, given some current physical theories, chance it is a viable explanation of the cosmic fine-tuning we see.
Like I mentioned earlier, the multiverse is a valid concept that could be the explanation, but I don't know how to falsify the multiverse, and I don't like the idea of relying on an unfalsifiable concept. That said, the likelihood of a universe existing which can support life does depend on how many universes exist. I may not be willing to take the position that it is definitively true, but since Dan is about to address the critique, I will take the position that he is unable to rule out the possibility. But I do appreciate Dan's steelman here. He seems to appreciate the math, which is a simple enough calculation. The number of expected life-bearing universes is the probability of a universe-bearing life times the number of universes. If that second number is actually infinite, and there is a multiverse with varied cosmic constants, then it is a completely satisfactory answer to the fine-tuning problem.
But let me spell out a few major problems with this objection. First, for the nerds amongst us, check out a brilliant rejoinder to the multiverse objection developed by Roger Penrose of Oxford in his 2004 book The Road to Reality.
Which I'd encourage anybody to check out, but I'm not about to read, summarize, and refute a book right now. This video is between me and Dan, so if you want Penrose's opinion, I'm afraid you'll have to go read it yourself.
A simpler problem with the multiverse objection is that it seems to run afoul of Occam's razor, which favors explanations with fewer entities and less ad hoc propositions. The argument here would be that the multiverse objection unnecessarily posits an infinite number of entities in order to explain our universe, rather than simply appealing to a single creator.
We already know for a fact that it is possible for a universe to exist, because we live in one. All the multiverse posits is that there is no restriction to just one, that our universe's existence does not preclude the existence of some independent universe. But if that's true, whatever reason led to our universe could equally lead to another, and another, and another, such that there are infinite universes. To truly solve the fine-tuning problem, we must also make the assumption that the constants could be different. But if we grant the opposite assumption that they couldn't be, then physical necessity solves fine-tuning, and the multiverse is a moot point. So discounting this, the multiverse only posits one assumption from which the infinite universes are derived. It does not make an infinite number of separate assumptions, one for each other universe. On the other hand, a single creator has all sorts of separate assumptions tacked on. The assumption of necessary existence, of omniscience, of omnipotence, of maximal greatness, of divine simplicity. There are all these other assumptions baked into the God concept, and so Occam's razor does not cut in Dan's favor. He's made mostly good points so far, but I think this is one of his mistakes.
A more serious nail in the coffin of the multiverse objection is that physicists who are experts in fine-tuning, like Luke Barnes and Roger Penrose and Paul Davies, they've pointed out that all our viable models of a multiverse actually require a multiverse generator that is extraordinarily fine-tuned itself. The net result would be that even if this objection is successful, it fails, only kicking the fine-tuning problem back a step.
Maybe in one of my future videos I'll have to go read up on these physicists to really discuss this point. But right now, all I'm thinking is that just because a model is considered viable today does not mean it's the correct model. But we don't know everything about inflation and relativity, knowledge which I suspect would be required to build a representative model of the multiverse. Without having a model we know to be correct, I don't see how we can know that a multiverse requires fine-tuning itself.
But my major beef with the multiverse objection is that without any solid evidence, and with no possible future access to evidence either, it explains away the good evidence we do have of design right now in what amounts to be a philosophical sleight of hand.
This point I'll agree with. As I said, the multiverse is unfalsifiable, and I'd rather not rely on it. But if we are considering possible explanations for the appearance of fine-tuning, then it's an equal possibility to the God proposition. Like with the multiverse, we have no solid evidence of a God, and given what Dan said earlier about God wanting us to grow in our spiritual, moral, and intellectual maturity, without his direct and overbearing influence, it seems unlikely that we would ever get such evidence in the future.
For an analogy, imagine you and me were playing a high-stakes game of poker, where after dealing out 10 hands, I just happen to get a royal flush every time as the dealer. Obviously, I clear you out of all your chips, and you've lost your life savings. Now, what would you rationally conclude? Did I just get lucky, or am I cheating? Now, suppose you were about to shoot me for dishonest dealing, but I tell you that, hey, this really did just happen by chance, and that the improbability of this crazy event can be overcome simply by the fact that there is an infinite number of universes in which you and I have played this exact same high-stakes game, and we've played it an infinite number of times. And you happen to just exist in the unlucky reality where I do randomly get 10 royal flushes. Now, that may be a possible explanation, but will you believe it? Hell no, because there's no reasonable evidence to support that conclusion.
Of course I wouldn't accept such an explanation, but there's a good reason. It's about comparative probability. You weigh the odds that somebody is a cheater against the odds that they actually did get 10 royal flushes. The latter probability is nearly 1 in 10 to the 60, and even being extremely generous, 1 out of every few million dealers might be dumb enough to try this. 1 royal flush is a lucky natural occurrence, occurring once every about 650,000 hands. 2 in a row is extremely suspicious. I'm pretty sure the player would shoot the dealer on the 3rd repetition because even in a multiverse, there would be more cheater dealers who've dealt 3 flushes in a row than honest dealers who have. If you're generous enough to wait for 10 such events to happen, it's practically a guarantee. The multiverse is not some statistical get-out-of-jail-free card. The only reason it works as an objection to fine-tuning is because of its pairing with the anthropic principle. Only if our existence depended on dealing 10 royal flushes in a row should we be unsurprised to witness 10 royal flushes. On the other hand, if we're an outside entity that gets to experience every single dealing of the cards, and we expect to have to wait through a quintillion dealings before ever seeing such an unlikely event, we'd be baffled and rightfully amazed at seeing such a thing happen in our lifetime. If you want more on this distinction, you may find my video on using Skittles to prove God interesting, so I'll link it here.
See the analogy to fine-tuning? We're given all the hallmarks of design in this one universe we can observe, and the only universe we can ever observe. The multiverse objection just reeks of motivated reasoning, a sleight of hand to avoid the implications of the most reasonable conclusion.
The analogy fails because the anthropic principle does not apply to the poker players. Dan did well to acknowledge this as a key point in the multiverse objection, but it seems he failed to include it in this analogy.
There are other objections worth considering, like if our universe is designed, who designed the designer? So check out our video on who created God.
One of my favorite questions, and something which leads to the primary objection I have to God. It is that question that leads to my argument of ice, which rules out a designer. So let's go check that video out really quick before returning for Dan's rebuttals to the fifth and final objection.
Everyone has an origin story. Whether we're listening to our grandparents telling stories about their youth or watching the creators of the Marvel franchise spell out how our favorite hero came to be, we all love a good origin story. So when newcomers hear Christians talking about how God created the universe, well, it can be natural to wonder if God too has a creator. So what does a Christian story say about God's origin story? Who made God?
Given that Dan starts this clip by saying that everyone has an origin story, I'll be disappointed if he says the Christian answer is that there isn't one. But I've been exposed to a lot of Christians, and I'm not expecting him to say anything new, so I'll try to temper my disappointment if it happens.
Now, it might surprise you to learn that this well-meaning question has often been sharpened rhetorically into an argument against Christianity.
It doesn't surprise me whatsoever, given that I am in fact one of the people who sharpens that argument. In the past, I'd take this moment to tell you to go watch my video on the argument device, but now that I've made a follow-up video, I'll tell you to go watch that one on my argument against solipsism instead. It's the sharp stick I got out of the question, and it isn't so blunt as to only be a weapon against Christianity. It covers most gods.
If Christians invoke God to explain the universe because everything needs a cause, then surely that means God too needs a cause. So who created God? But this attempt at a rhetorical gotcha is actually a cosmic fail, showing how some of the loudest critiques of Christianity completely misunderstand Christianity.
I'd contend that I strives right at the heart of Christian theology, given that any mind, divine or otherwise, as the uncaused cause, is exactly what it rules out.
First, it gets the cosmological argument wrong. Christians don't argue that everything needs a cause. We actually argue that everything that begins to exist needs a cause. Which means, second, since God did not begin to exist, God doesn't need a prior cause.
Okay, but my argument says that minds must have a cause. When Christians use the cosmological argument to conclude that God, a divine mind, is the uncaused cause, it is exactly that which I have a problem with. But if Christians want to use the standard that things which begin to exist have a cause, then I can happily agree with the argument and point out that we don't know the universe to have begun to exist. For all we know, it has always existed, and the Big Bang was merely a transition point marking the furthest back in time we were able to observe. Therefore, the universe is the uncaused cause, no God necessary.
This is one of those rare times where the question is the problem. Because by asking who made God, we're assuming that God is made. That like us, God came into existence out of non-existence.
My argument device relies on no such assumption. In fact, I grant that the Christian God never came into existence, but has instead always existed, insofar as the word always can apply to something before time. That very property is what I deny. I understand the Christian claim about God's uncaused nature perfectly well. I'm saying that such an uncaused mind is tantamount to solipsism, which I reject.
This notion of an uncreated creator, or of a necessary being on which all contingent things depend, is actually something that rescues us from absurdity. Imagine you're a domino, and your parents before you are another. You're the effect, they are the cause. Well, if we stretch this chain of events back, eventually we arrive at God. But if God too is just another domino, and then God is a creator that's another, well then we bump into this problem known as an infinite regress. Because an ever-increasing number of dominoes stretching back into infinity means that our domino would never fall. But we are here. Which means the number of dominoes before us, it actually had to be finite. Philosophers call this causal finitism.
But just because philosophers have a name for it doesn't mean it's true. I realize that it matches with a lot of people's intuition, because infinite chains don't have starting points, and so how could the chain of causality get going? Dan simply asserts on this intuition that if the chain were infinite, then our domino would never fall. But I think there is a hidden assumption here, that a domino must start falling in order for the rest to follow. But Dan is missing the possibility that dominoes may have always been falling. Infinite chains don't have starting points, and so too there must be no first domino to fall. To say that there is no beginning to the chain of dominoes falling is analogous to saying that God has no beginning. I am willing to grant both as possibilities. But if you remember back when I said that if the complexity of the watchmaker argument could be combined with the unity of the cosmic fine-tuning argument, I would find that very convincing. This is exactly what I've done with ice. God is claimed to be the singular uncaused cause, and at the same time can make complex moral judgments and know every complexity of reality. It's exactly as convincing an argument as I said it'd be, it's just that it points away from God. I don't know if, before the Big Bang, there was a first cause or an infinite regress. I tend to lean towards regress, but I cannot say for sure. Whichever it is, I often refer to it as the fundamental thing. As I define it, this is whatever exists uncaused, independently of anything else. It can apply to an uncaused cause or an uncaused chain of causes. In other words, a first cause or an infinite causal regress. In either case, there is no way that it is so complex as to be a coherent intelligence.
And dating right back to the ancient philosophers, Christian thinkers have long argued that means we need to have an uncaused cause, a prime mover, a necessary being. God is the hand that set all dominoes in motion.
I'm mostly fine with this. It's a very similar idea to what I mean by the fundamental thing, with the exception that I don't rule out an infinite regress. The fundamental thing is not synonymous with a prime mover or an uncaused cause, since those do explicitly rule out the regress. But I could say that the fundamental thing is like a necessary being, because if an infinite chain exists, it exists necessarily. What I don't understand is the jump to calling this being God, and attaching to it the idea that it is a source of knowledge, wisdom, and morality. I can accept that either something set the dominoes in motion, or that there is some necessity to the dominoes always having been falling. But why this cause must also be an intelligent, free-willed agent needs to be demonstrated, not just asserted.
And this is exactly what the Christian story teaches about God. That unlike us, God doesn't have an origin story, he has an eternal story. Repeated some 6,800 times across the Old Testament, God's chosen name to reveal himself is Yahweh, which translates as pure existence. I am that I am.
Ah, there's the disappointment. Dan may be presenting the arguments with honesty, but that doesn't make him immune to mistakes. If he or any other Christian can demonstrate that the Bible was written by a god, I'll take it more seriously. But until then, its explanation that God simply is doesn't count for anything. The fact remains, God is the single most intelligent being possible, and Dan accepts that such a being simply exists. It is what it is. I guess I believe the same thing about the universe, only Occam's razor points in my favor. So with that, let's get back to the original video and Dan's rebuttal to the final objection to fine-tuning.
But let me close with one final, maybe more personal objection. Objection number 5, the complexity objection. Now, more popular level critics, like the atheist YouTuber Alex O'Connor you saw at the beginning, they've argued that the fine-tuning argument is simply too complex to serve God's purposes in Revelation. I mean, it depends upon a super recent discovery that billions of people never had access to across history. And it requires a working familiarity with physics and probability that rules out the kinds of people who never clicked on this video in the first place, or the ones who clicked away because they got bored. Now, surely such a technical argument is a weird way for God to reveal himself if he wants a personal relationship with us, right? I mean, it doesn't exactly move the heartstrings or incline you towards worship.
Once again, I feel like this relies too much on assuming the mind of God. I see no reason why he can't have multiple different paths to revelation, this being one among many. I'd hate to be the kind of person who rules out the fine-tuning argument because it doesn't tug at my heartstrings enough, while also ruling out the moral argument because it only tugs at the heart. And as to the recency of the relevant discoveries, don't forget our perspective. You and I sit here in the second millennium thinking we are the culmination of human history. We look back at the last 10,000 years and see it leading up to us. Surely if we have only just discovered this fine-tuning argument, then it is unknown to the vast majority of human history. But for all we know, there are millions of years of human history left. Perhaps we are early, and that the discoveries in cosmology happening now will lay the groundwork of belief for trillions of individuals yet to come.
So let me close with 2 responses I hope will help. First, given the degree to which atheists have clung to science as a tool to dispel belief in God, it seems entirely appropriate to me that in his foreknowledge and providence, as an act of grace and a serious challenge, God would disrupt this skeptical strategy by opting for fine-tuning to be discovered now at the very bottom of the scientific glass.
And I agree with this point. It's like what I was saying about how perhaps God intends different arguments to convince different people. Maybe someone like me can reject the arguments from morality and beauty on the grounds that they aren't logical. But if I look into that logic deep enough, I'll find the fine-tuning argument. Other people could have had other reasons to believe in God, and certainly many of them did before we knew about the fine-tuning problem. If you remember from Dan's original explanation of the problem, I said that we don't see the dials clearly enough to know for sure that physical necessity cannot account for them. I want to clarify that I don't think it's problematic for God to make us reach so far. I'm only saying that with how far we can reach, we don't have enough to rationally conclude in a God.
And second, on a deeper level, you don't have to be a science whiz to experience how nature speaks. See, the fine-tuning argument, it might not be your cup of tea, but it's just one technical and scientifically articulated species of a more intuitive step. To observe order and beauty in nature, in the stars of the night sky, or a butterfly's dance, or a spider's web, and allow it to inspire awe that leads you to worship God as the craftsman of this cosmic cathedral.
I don't deny the awe I feel towards the world around me, or the order I witness. Spiders, butterflies, stars, all of it, I find to be absolutely fascinating. But it wasn't a good argument for God when it was intuitive, and it isn't a good argument for God even with all the scientific understanding. It does stand up well to the 5 objections presented in this video, so I can see why Dan is still a Christian. But that is because 4 of the objections were garbage. Were I a Christian, I wouldn't find them sufficient to give up my beliefs. This isn't to say that Dan is dishonestly representing my views, only presenting the nuts and the straw men. No, on the contrary, I've heard atheists make all of these arguments before. But I don't want people to think that I have bad reasons to be an atheist. I want them to think I have good ones. So if I hear a bad one, I'll agree with a theist all day long that that particular reason is no good. And of the 5 objections, the only one to be worth anything, the multiverse objection, is a valid point that Dan should struggle with more. But at the same time, I'm willing to grant him that it's possible that no other universes exist. I don't want to rely on the multiverse objection, and I think I have better options. So with that, let me give 3 more objections, which I welcome Dan or any other theist to take on. In both Dan's version and Craig's version of the argument, 3 possible explanations for the appearance of fine-tuning are presented: chance, necessity, and design. My first objection is that for almost all the constants, chance is never properly calculated to be ruled out. Percent change is not the same thing as percent probability, and so giving how much the dials can wiggle isn't as relevant as people intuit. My second objection is that we do not know enough about physics to say for sure that necessity is not an option. Our knowledge of relativity, inflation, and how universes form is incomplete, and it is possible that an explanation lies somewhere in this unknown. And for the one constant that is a probability, the low entropy of the initial universe, mathematical symmetry could be the explanation, falling under the physical necessity option. These 2 alone are enough to rebut the fine-tuning argument, given that it carries the burden of proof to demonstrate a designer. But my third objection is that by my argument device, design isn't even an option. Design simply introduces more problems than it solves, especially if said designer is of an uncaused nature. That leaves physical necessity and chance as the only options, so even by the standards of Dan's abductive argument, I find them to be the more likely. Now, I don't think Dan needs the advice I'm about to give, but it's my standard closer and it's never bad advice. So if you need something to do after this video, go read a fucking book.